everybody. My name is Alexis Fernandez, and I'm the CalFresh Policy Bureau Chief here at CDSS. I have with me Aubrey Biscoe, our lead Disaster CalFresh Policy Analyst with the department. And thank you for making the time to have us. We really wish we could have been there in person, but I had to deal with another big policy change that's on the horizon related to CalFresh, so I was at a meeting this morning. But over the last week or so, we've been working closely with your disaster response team to identify options as they relate to issuing additional food benefits to households impacted by the fire in your county. And with the recent approval from the Federal Food and Nutrition Service to operate Disaster SNAP, we're now transitioning from planning to implementation, so it's just around the corner. Today we're going to take a deep dive into eligibility policy, and I hope that even though I'm on the phone here in Sacramento with Aubrey, we can keep it as casual as possible because it's just us and your team in Shasta. So we're holding time at the end for question and answers, but Melanie, if you could help me kind of be my eyes in the room, stop me if there's an immediate clarification that is needed or a question comes up. I can't see you, but you can certainly interrupt me. So please don't hesitate to do that.
Sure.
And then if we have, questions that we can't answer while we're here today, we will write them down and we'll make sure to do the necessary research and get back to your team in writing. As I'm sure you know, Disaster CalFresh does have some unique rules that are different from regular CalFresh policy, and most of us are a lot more comfortable in the regular CalFresh policy world, but we've operated now a few times in the last year, so we're feeling better about providing answers live, but of course we can follow up if there's a tricky scenario or household circumstance that you can think of. And then just before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to take a moment to just say thank you in advance for your work to make this happen. It takes an extraordinary amount of time and energy. I know that a lot of staff are going to be working late. You're going to be working on the weekends. We appreciate that commitment. We have the luxury of being in Sacramento, and you all are on the ground doing the hard work. So we just want to say thanks, and we have seen that this program has had a great impact in other disaster impacted communities, and so we are glad that the individuals and families in Shasta are going to be able to take advantage of this. So I just want to start there. And with that, what I'll do is hand it off to Aubrey Biscoe. He's going to walk us through some introductory slides on general disaster CalFresh concepts, and then I'm going to take it back over when we get into eligibility. So Aubrey, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Alexis. So moving on to the next slide, what is Disaster CalFresh? First, before Disaster CalFresh or a request even happens, an affected area must have received a presidential declaration for individual assistance before we can even request it. And that can sometimes be a little confusing because there are 3 or 4 different declarations that roll out leading up to this individual assistance, but those are the key words for DCalFresh, is individual assistance. Disaster CalFresh also provides temporary food assistance for households impacted by a natural or man-made disaster. The program provides temporary benefits to eligible disaster survivors while also facilitating the issuance of supplemental CalFresh benefits for ongoing households. To be eligible for DCalFresh, a household must have lived or worked in the identified disaster area at the time of the disaster, been affected by the disaster, and also needs to meet certain DCalFresh eligibility criteria. Next slide. DCalFresh household composition is established as of the date the disaster struck based on the Presidential Declaration for Individual Assistance. So for Shasta County and the Carr Fire, this particular event is tied to a start date of July 23rd, 2018. A household includes those people living, purchasing, and preparing food together at the time of the disaster. DCalFresh households do not include those people who are temporarily staying with the applicant due to the disaster. Also note that household members excluded from the CalFresh household as of the date the disaster struck may be eligible for CalFresh, and we'll be discussing excluded members later on in this presentation. Something to remember too, that CalFresh households probably aren't going to be familiar with what it means to purchase and prepare food together. Shasta County, you really need to be conscious of when interviewing disaster CalFresh households that there could be a gap in some of the language and terminology, and just be conscious of that. And the same can be true again for a lot of terminology that CalFresh households are already familiar with, but CalFresh households are not. So provide clarity when you think it is needed. The client may not always speak up or even ask questions. So for the CalFresh application period, the county can only accept applications, CalFresh applications from new households and requests for supplements from ongoing households during that period. And for Shasta County, as you guys know, you guys are going to be operating for 7 non-consecutive days between August 22nd to 25th, as well as August 27th to 29th. In general, county offices should not begin accepting applications until public information and outreach has begun. Staff have been trained, resources are in place, some of which include adequate application sites, human comfort, and especially not until state systems are ready to begin CalFresh processing and issuances.
And I will just jump in here to say that that's what we've been hard at work doing over the last week or so. So your disaster response team is coordinating all of the client communications and outreach so folks know when to come into the office. And as you know, this training in and of itself is one of those preparation steps. So this all is on track for Wednesday the 22nd.
So moving on to the next slide, we're going to take a look at CalFresh benefit period, which for you guys is going to be July 23rd until August 21st. And the benefit period is critical to determining CalFresh eligibility, and it's the time period during which disaster-related expenses may be counted and the start date used to determine household composition. Only income, resources, and expenses during the benefit period are considered in determining CalFresh eligibility. The benefit period begins on the date of the disaster, which was July 23rd for the car fire. That date is generally the first day of the incident period, and is in this time, which is provided by the Presidential Disaster Declaration for Individual Assistance, or IA. Taking a look at how we can assist ongoing CalFresh households. So for parity, the county will issue individually requested or automatic supplements to ongoing or existing CalFresh households during the application period. They can also issue supplements to ongoing households whose benefits were previously replaced as a result of the same disaster. So it's conceivable that an ongoing household could receive replacement benefits as well as a supplement, either individually or automatically. The amount of a supplement is equal to the difference between the maximum allotment for that household size and the household's regular CalFresh allotment. In other words, if you get issued $100, the maximum is $150. That supplement for that ongoing household will be $50. And as a reminder, an ongoing CalFresh household can call the office to request a supplement individually. And when that happens, the county can mail the household a CF-303 to be signed and returned within 10 days.
So I want us to hit pause before we dive into eligibility, just to check if there are any questions on these basic kind of concepts. The benefit period, the application period, they will come up later in the presentation. So are we good to keep moving forward?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks, Aubrey. Now we're going to get into some basic CalFresh eligibility. And for each of these concepts, we'll dive in the upcoming slides. So to be eligible for CalFresh, a household cannot already be receiving CalFresh. And they must meet the 3 basic eligibility criteria that we're going to run through now. Before we jump into the 3 criteria, and Aubrey already alluded to this, I do want to make one important point that excluded household members, so students, SSI recipients, non-citizens who are excluded from the household today may, as individuals, be eligible for disaster CalFresh. it's possible you'll run into a situation where some households are receiving regular CalFresh and will be eligible for a supplement, and some household members were excluded and may be eligible for disaster CalFresh for that one disaster CalFresh benefit month. In these cases, you can issue both a supplement and disaster CalFresh to excluded members. And we make a big deal of this only because what we saw in the Northern California fires and in Ventura and Santa Barbara is quite a few of these households, because they were already familiar with the county office and reaching out to the county office for support. And so they had heard about disaster CalFresh rolling out in their community and were ready to apply when it was available. So the three basic eligibility criteria that must be met are sort of what I call first level eligibility criteria. So that is, you must determine that these criteria are met before you proceed to determine whether the household meets financial eligibility criteria. So these three basic or first level criteria are residency. The household must have lived or worked in the disaster area at the time of the disaster. So in this case, they have to have lived or worked in Shasta County on July 23rd. That is your key residency question. The next is the household must plan on purchasing food during the disaster benefit period. So remember, the benefit period is that 30 days that goes from July 23rd to August 21st, which most people are going to eat and purchase food during that time period. But just as background, if you were, for example, in a shelter that provided you meals and you weren't planning to purchase your own food, you may not meet this criteria. But I think since most evacuations have been listed, most people are going to meet this criteria. And then you have to have experienced an adverse effect. So basically, a negative impact due to the disaster, including the loss of food. And we are going to dive into those adverse effects on the next few slides. I think overall, residency and intent to purchase are relatively easy to determine, but these adverse effects are kind of a unique concept related to disaster CalFresh. Let's start with the first category, which is a loss of income or inaccessible income. So this adverse effect is common, as lost or inaccessible income includes a reduction or termination of income. In other words, you've lost work, either permanently or temporary, or your receipt of income has been delayed. Maybe your employer is unable to provide the income that they owe you in a timely manner. And for this particular event, again, that loss of income had to have occurred between July 23rd and August 21st. Okay, the next category of an adverse effect is inaccessible liquid resources, which is inaccessible cash. This adverse effect is rare. It requires that your liquid resources, aka your cash, are inaccessible during the benefit period. A common example is in, for example, flood-ravaged zones. Texas, Louisiana all experienced this, where the banks were actually closed during the benefit period and households were unable to go to the bank. And even then, because households can usually access cash via online banking or other ATMs, it's really quite rare. That said, we've seen here in California that some households have lost access to cash when their home has burned down. So while rare, you may still run across an instance of an inaccessible cash resource. The third category of an adverse effect, and possibly the most common, is a deductible disaster-related expense. So as the name suggests, these are out-of-pocket disaster-related expenses that are both incurred and paid during the benefit period. Emphasis on the phrase incurred and paid. The household must have actually paid the expense during the benefit period. So for example, If a household charges a disaster-related expense on their credit card, but they don't pay it during the disaster benefit period, so between July 23rd and August 21st, that expense would not qualify. Now, I recognize that is a very stringent policy. We are constrained by federal guidance in this area, and it's just something to keep an eye out, that you're clarifying for your clients that is an expense that must have been paid during the 30 days. And we can look at some common disaster-related expenses. Again, this is a list of may include but not limited to, right? So you might see that people have had home or business repairs, temporary shelter expenses, especially the cost of a hotel if you've been evacuated, other evacuation expenses including gasoline or any other type of transportation costs, home or business property protection, any medical expense due to personal injury. You know, we saw folks who had either gone back to a site and maybe incurred things like needing stitches or things along those lines, and that expense would count. Any pet boarding fees incurred, expenses related to replacing personal and household items. So this is anything from clothing, appliances, educational materials. Even if they had to replace them temporarily while they were evacuated, those would qualify. Disaster damage vehicle expenses, storage expenses. Again, the list is not exhaustive, but it gives you a sense of what types of costs you might explore, particularly when you're interviewing someone, because it's really hard to wrap your head around all the different expenses you might have incurred during this time. And as you'll see in later slides, these disaster-related expenses are key to bringing the household below the disaster CalFresh income limit. Okay, so in addition to lost income, inaccessible liquid resources, and those disaster-related expenses, food loss alone may qualify a household for disaster CalFresh in terms of these first-level eligibility criteria. If the household's only adverse effect is food loss, they must still meet the financial eligibility. So again, if this is the only adverse effect, it gets them past the first kind of set of eligibility criteria, but they still need to be assessed for a total income below the disaster gross income limit, which we're going to discuss. Okay, so now that we understand the basic eligibility criteria, and before we dive into the application, interview, the income limit, verifications, all these very exciting topics, I want to take a minute to circle back to excluded household members. So as we mentioned, excluded household members may be eligible for disaster CalFresh. The regular CalFresh restricted eligibility criteria include students, citizenship status, intentional program violations, work registration, so folks that maybe have been sanctioned for work registration rules, ABODs, which don't yet apply in your county, but these restrictions don't apply to regular disaster, do not apply to disaster CalFresh. They only apply to regular CalFresh. Therefore, those previously excluded members may apply and be eligible for disaster CalFresh. They need to apply as a household separate and apart from the ongoing CalFresh household. So they may complete the same application. We're going to get to that. But the other members are going to get a supplement, and the newly eligible person under DCalFresh is going to get basically the allotment for a household of one. And we are going to talk a little bit later about income proration, because you will need to take that into consideration if you have a member that was previously excluded and their income have been prorated to the regular CalFresh household. So that is coming up. Okay, so for this disaster, we are only accepting applications in person. So the Disaster CalFresh application, the CS385, will be accepted in person, and requests for supplements using a CS303 will be accepted in person or by phone, also during the application period. Important thing to note here is that you are able to use the CS303, the affidavit for replacement benefits, all year long. You've been using them for individual replacement requests the last few weeks, and so this time limit where you can only use the 303 to request supplements during the application period is specific to supplements. You may still use the 303 for replacement at any time. So these limitations only have to do with Disaster CalFresh. While the shorter CS303 is a great go-to form for issuing a supplement, if a CalFresh household, an ongoing CalFresh household, accidentally completes a 385, please do not make them also complete a 303. You can use the 385 to issue the supplement as well. So basically, don't make them submit two documents. Go ahead and use the 385. We've seen in the past that just confusion, households will fill out the Disaster CalFresh application unintentionally, and we don't want to add an extra layer to what they need to do. Okay, here's an important reminder. So a household eligible for Disaster CalFresh, so not an ongoing household, they may come in and apply for Disaster CalFresh, and you may get a sense that they are also eligible for regular CalFresh. Let's say that the person tells you, not only did I lose my income during the benefit period, but I've lost my job, and I really don't know when I'm going to get a new job. And you think to yourself, well, maybe they're eligible for regular CalFresh. It's a great thing to connect them to that program for the long-term support, but that household has to apply for regular CalFresh separate and apart from Disaster CalFresh. So that is, the same worker, the same eligibility worker, cannot process the Disaster CalFresh application and the regular CalFresh application. The household, unfortunately, must complete two separate applications, two separate interviews, two separate verification submissions with two separate workers. You have to keep those two processes completely apart from each other. So that is just something to keep in mind. We want to encourage households to connect to the long-term support, but if they're looking to get the maximum allotment for this DCalFresh month, they're going to have to do that separate and apart. Okay, so now on to the DCalFresh interview, which is one of the uniquely challenging requirements of Disaster CalFresh. The interview must be completed in person. So similar to regular CalFresh, households may apply, or rather, may designate an authorized representative to apply on their behalf if they're unable to apply in person. But at this point, we don't have a telephone interview. So in particular, when you're serving elderly individuals or persons with disabilities, the authorized representative option may be most beneficial if they're unable to make it into the office. And you would apply regular authorized representative standards, but otherwise there is no general option for phone interviews, even for elderly and disabled applicants. And we recognize that's a challenge, and we're working on it from a policy perspective, but for this, this implementation, that is where we're at. So some, as Aubrey mentioned, Disaster CalFresh eligible households may be acquainted with CalFresh, but others may not. So the interview process and some basic eligibility concepts may not be familiar. We have found that in other disaster areas, the interviews can take a little longer, just in terms of explaining the process and how to answer the questions adequately. So that is just something to keep in mind. As well, we've noted in other disaster response that impacted households that have really experienced extensive loss may have difficulty completing the interview because you're sort of asking them to rehash a lot of the challenges they faced over the last month. Even talking about the expenses that they've incurred could bring up, you know, just a sensitive topic of conversation. So just keep in mind, particularly amongst eligibility staff who are working with clients directly, that the interview may require more time and a little bit more of a listening ear, if you will, because we have seen that some households are compelled to share and may have difficulty actually kind of describing what it is that they experienced. So as with any CalFresh case, we all know that interview is an important part of the certification process. It allows you, the eligibility worker, time to review potentially confusing concepts with the applicant and to verify information that they've presented on the application. Like regular CalFresh, interview areas should be set up to protect applicant privacy to the extent possible. And during the CalFresh interview, you want to determine whether the household first meets the basic or kind of first level eligibility criteria we discussed. And eventually you want to establish financial eligibility and collect this verification. So to this end, here is what we think EW should ask about. It's sort of a list, a cheat sheet, if you will. In order to determine household comp, you can ask for the proof of identity for head of household, confirm the names and birthdays of other household members, and just straight up ask the household what was the composition on July 23rd. For residency or employment in the area in Shasta County, you can ask for proof if needed. But again, generally speaking, people's verifications will have residency information or will indicate residency sufficiently enough not to ask for additional verification. For income available income available and anticipated during the entire benefit period, you're asking this because we're going to use it to determine the financial eligibility, obviously. Then if eligible based on having worked in the area, you may consider confirming the place of employment for all of those members who say they worked in the area. So just an additional question, if someone is not using standard residency, you can ask for details about where they work. To determine adverse effects, you can ask about what liquid resources or cash was available at the start of the benefit period. Ask about the impact of the disaster on the household. Ask what negative impacts they actually experienced. Was it fire damage, power outage, mandatory evacuation? Kind of explore that with them. Ask them how much they paid for these expenses, how they paid for the expenses. So did they pay it out of pocket? Was it, did they pay with cash? Do they have any receipts? Did they actually pay off credit card bills, things like that? And you're going to have to ask if they plan to receive any reimbursement within the benefit period for these expenses. Now, this is quite rare because, let's just be honest, I don't think most insurance companies are paying out for damage on a home within 2 weeks of the damage on the home, but it is a question to ask if they plan to receive reimbursement for an expense during that month, July 23rd to August 21st, then we have to consider that as well. Okay, I'm going to hit pause here before getting into the disaster gross income limit, just to check to see if we have any questions or clarifications on that last set of slides.
So, yeah, early on, there were 2 slides in a row, one saying that you can receive standard CalFresh, a supplement, and disaster CalFresh. The first line and the next one said you cannot receive CalFresh and disaster CalFresh.
Okay, so Alexis, it was on the slides that said you could receive disaster CalFresh and supplemental, and then the next slide said you could not receive supplemental and disaster CalFresh. So could you clarify that?
I'm not sure.
The ongoing CalFresh household slide.
So, okay, I think there's just some nuance here, and maybe our slides aren't particularly clear, and we could work on that. But so here's the general rule. If you are an included household member of an ongoing CalFresh household, you are eligible for a supplement up to the maximum allotment for your household size. In general, if you're on regular CalFresh, but the exception to that, you are excluded fresh household. So we are excluded members to get disaster CalFresh. So there's a narrow set of circumstances where a household could come in, the included members receive a supplement, members receive the disaster CalFresh benefit for a single month. Does that make sense?
You are breaking up too much, but if I understand it correctly, the excluded member would get a benefit for a single month, and the current household members would get a supplement up to the maximum benefit allotment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that if they've already received a supplement?
The question is, Alexis, is even if they receive the replacement benefits and the mass replacement?
Yes. So remember, the replacement benefit is a replacement of your CalFresh benefits that you already got for that month. The supplement is the difference between what you got and the maximum. So together, they make you whole.
Now, are these households of one getting the whole benefit, or three households of two getting the same thing? Does that make sense?
Okay.
To follow up on that, so she was saying that the supplement is up to the maximum household, so the maximum grades. So does that mean that an ongoing CalFresh household would need to CF 385 to CF 303 that maximum grade?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a CF 303 for replacement and for the disaster supplement?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, did somebody else have a question? Yes, Fritzy.
For cases with ineligible people, the applications have to be separate. So say a mom has 3 SSI kids. There are 3 separate applications, or 1 application for the 3 ineligible members.
Did you get that, Alexis?
Yep, I heard that. So I heard, let's say it's 1 grandma and 3 kids that are on SSI. So the grandma would come in. Let's say grandma's receiving regular CalFresh, and the 3 children are excluded. So she should fill out, on behalf of her entire household, a CF 385. Using the 385, you can issue grandma a supplement if she's not already at the maximum for a household of 1. And then for the 3 children, you would be issued disaster CalFresh for a household of 3.
So did you guys understand that? So is it okay if I answer, Alexis?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so basically what she's saying is grandma will get a supplement if she's already not receiving the max allotment. So if she's already received the allotment of 192, she is not going to get a supplement. The 3 children will be on their own case. So it'll be 1 case of 3 children, and they will get the max benefit for a household size of 3.
Yep.
She would need 1 CF 385 for the children.
No, for all of them. For all of them.
For all of them.
Yes.
That 385 in place of the 303?
Yes.
So that makes it doable.
Yes. Okay, yes.
So we're doing this after the fact, so what's your after? I mean,
So did you hear the question, Alexis?
No, I didn't. Say that one again.
So since it's after the benefit period, what would be the application date?
Good question. So the application date is still the day that you received the disaster CalFresh application during the application period. So one of those 7 days. What's unique and a little bit weird about disaster CalFresh is instead of looking to the last 30 days, you're looking back to the benefit period. And you guys have the luxury that your benefit period is not that far back. When we did Ventura or Santa Barbara, it was like a month earlier, and so it was so hard for people to remember what expenses they had incurred and to come up with the verifications. But for this one, no matter what day the application is received, you're asking them to look back to July 23rd through August 21st. Anything that happened after that period, between the benefit period and when they apply, is irrelevant.
Did you understand?
I understood that. I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to do that in the system. That's all.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
The disaster period, the same as the benefit period?
The benefit period, okay, so Alexis, the question
Yeah.
was, is the disaster period the same as the benefit period?
Yes, those terms can be used interchangeably.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so shall we keep going to the disaster gross income limit?
Yes.
Okay, so what exactly are the disaster CalFresh financial eligibility criteria that we've been alluding to you? I present the disaster gross income limit in visual here. The DGIL groups income and resources together under one test. So this is important because it's very different from CalFresh. As you can see, what you need to do is add the total take-home income during the benefit period. So the total take-home income for July 23rd to August 21st, you need to add that to liquid resources available, so cash available during that same time period. You subtract those expenses that we talked about to determine whether the household is meets or is below the disaster gross income limit. So I will just say the most difficult part of it is double counting income and the resources. So the easiest way to keep these separate is to remember. So cash on hand is determined on the first of the benefit period. So what cash did you have available on third? Anything received during the remainder of the benefit period, so July 24th to August 21st, anything you got during that period would be considered income. And circles now individually. Okay.
Alexis, could you repeat that again? You were breaking up.
Okay, I think it might be are you on the computer speaker?
Yes.
Okay, it might be that. Let me try one more time.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll go back to my corny joke. I present to you the disaster gross income limit. So the disaster gross income limit groups income and resources together under one test, and that is what is significantly different between determining regular CalFresh eligibility and disaster CalFresh eligibility. So as you can see, what you need to do is add the total take-home income during the benefit period and cash on hand, liquid accessible resources. Once you've added that, you subtract those expenses that we discussed, and you'd use that to determine whether the household is at or below the income limit. When you're calculating the DGIL, the most important thing to do is to not double count income and resources. So the best way to do this is to ask yourself, what resources, so what cash did the household have available on the first day of the benefit period? On July 23rd, what was the cash available to the household? Anything received during the remainder of the benefit period, so from July 24th through August 21st, that's going to be the income. Did you get that time?
Yes.
Okay. So now we're just going to walk through each of the circles. So the total take-home pay of the household members, the key phrase here is take-home pay, not gross pay, take-home. So this is wages a household actually received after any payroll withholding, any public assistance payment or other unearned income, any self-employment income, but the key is what is directly available to the household. For the next circle on our chart, accessible liquid resources, we already talked a little bit about this, but it's basically cash on hand and funds available in a checking or savings account on the first day of the benefit period. It does not include retirement accounts or insurance payments, not the reimbursement that I suggested, but just an insurance payment for a major payout of what do you call it, insurance plan. Disaster assistance received or expected to receive during the benefit period, that also does not count. And payments from federal, state, or local government agencies, those are not considered cash liquid resources. Okay. Ensure that you are only adding accessible cash. So I don't think this is going to be a problem in this particular disaster, but just remember that those inaccessible cash resources are not considered when determining the disaster gross income limit. Okay, so once you've added the total take-home pay and liquid resources, you need to subtract the disaster-related expenses. So we've already discussed, but the disaster-related expenses include expenses that the household paid out of pocket during the disaster benefit period. And just that note that I feel like I'm like a broken record, but remember, it's not just incurred, but incurred and paid. Okay. Now, because things are never, ever easy, I'm going to hit pause, and I'm going to talk a little bit about income proration. And what you have on your screen is a chart that Ventura County put together during the most recent disaster, and we can provide you, Melanie, a printable version of this, but they kept it handy as a reference to deal with these households that were a mix of included and excluded members. So we can just walk through some components of the chart, but it's really just something you'll need to read on your own. But what Ventura outlined here was, depending on the reason the individual is excluded from the household, and they have some common ones at the top. So work sanction, SSI, SSP recipient, a non-citizen. Then there are some general rules for how you have to address the income. So for example, an ineligible student, their income was removed from the household when they were excluded. So in this case, you would count the individual student's income, but you would not allocate any income from the regular CalFresh case. For someone that was excluded because they were a non-citizen, you previously counted some of their income to the household and some amount you didn't count. So you would count the prorated income. So you would kind of keep what was applied to the household with the regular CalFresh household, and then what remains would be attributed to that excluded individual for the purposes of disaster CalFresh eligibility. So let's just go through a scenario that might be a little bit easier to explain. So a previously excluded father's income was prorated in the past to determine the eligibility of the ongoing CalFresh household, which includes the mother and 2 children. This is a pretty common reason for exclusion, citizenship status of the father. The father's income may be prorated to determine his eligibility for disaster CalFresh as a household of 1. So whatever income was assigned to the excluded father would be used for the disaster CalFresh household of 1. The ongoing CalFresh household, the mother and the 2 children, may be eligible for a supplement if not already at the maximum for a household of 3. The reason we allow for proration is because it provides for the household's income to be distributed across the disaster CalFresh household and the ongoing CalFresh household if both exist during the benefit period. And really what we saw is if we did not allow for the application of proration, dad would come in and you could potentially apply his total income for the disaster CalFresh case and he would not be deemed eligible. But when you apply proration, indeed you have a better picture of that father's available income. So just to wrap it up one more time, take-home income plus liquid resources minus the disaster-related expenses must be less than or equal to the disaster gross income limit. And I keep talking about that limit, but here it is in visual form. Keep in mind that every household under the disaster gross income limit is going to receive the maximum allotment for their household size. There is no variance. So a household of 3 that is under the DGL by a lot is going to get the same as a household of 3 who's under the DGL by $2. They're both going to get the maximum allotment for their household size. And that's really for administrative ease. So I'm going to pause before I go to verifications because that was a lot. Any questions?
Rose, you had a question?
For the IPD and the workstation, what about for the parents that have income that's already mid-period and so it's not being used yet, maybe, or it just hasn't been applied to that other CalFresh case yet?
Like mid-period income that was under ERT that
Okay.
wasn't applied yet.
Mid-period ERT that hasn't been applied yet for an excluded member.
Maybe I'm not understanding the question, but there's
So we have
no...
an excluded member that has reported income mid-period, and it hasn't been included into the budget yet. How would we include that, or would we cap that?
Yeah. So that might be one of those tricky questions we take offline, but I will tell you that in general, you're making the decision based on best available information at the time of the application. So you may have, some circumstances that you're not aware of, but you're making it based on what is available to you at that time. And we're going to get to this, but we're asking you to make a pretty quick eligibility determination because we have a issuance timeline. So you're making it based on best available info. And then, SNS is not on the line, so I'll just say this now. You want to be as accurate as possible, but there is no error rate, if you will, for these cases. So accuracy is very important because there is a review process, but we would not be looking at these cases and applying CalFresh rules.
Okay. Did you hear that, Rose? Okay. Veronica first.
Okay, so I want to go back to the grandma with the 3 children, the grandchildren. So the 3 grandchildren on SSI, which is like 972 right now. If you take the 3 children's income, they're going to be over the maximum allotment for the $504.
They don't access.
If they don't. So that's when we're going to go and we're going to start asking questions. Did they lose their clothes? Did they lose their
Yes.
food? And all that. And then we can apply it there.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's, I will admit, can I just make a comment that it's a little weird, but what you're doing is you're basically attributing those expenses to the children.
Right.
Even though you and I know the child didn't walk into Target to buy extra clothes, grandma did, but we are applying the expense to the house, the income for the 3 children.
On the disaster case.
Yes, for the disaster-related expenses only for CalFresh.
Perfect. What if I'm sorry, one more question. Even though grandma's on active food stamps already and she's just getting a supplement, but she lost her clothes and food, could you add that into the kids allotment or only the kids?
So you, for ongoing CalFresh households, you actually do not need to make a determination of any disaster-related expense. Basically, the reason supplements exist is for ongoing CalFresh households that we already know are low income and vulnerable to be equal to these new households who are coming in and getting disaster CalFresh. So we're increasing their benefits for parity with disaster CalFresh, but we're not asking them to prove expenses.
Okay.
For the proration of income, so the example was like an excluded father, we said we would only use his income for the disaster CalFresh, but for the rest of the household that's asking for a supplement, do we still take his income into account, or is it only the rest of the household without his income?
Did you hear that, Alexis?
No, I didn't get that one.
Okay, so for that example, the scenario you used where it was the dad that had prorated income and we used the prorated income for the family.
So for the supplement that you're processing for the rest of the household, do we still count the excluded members' income?
Do we still count the excluded members' income for determining the supplement?
No, so remember, for the supplement, there's no disaster gross income limit test. For the supplement, you're basically saying, since I already know that you are a low-income person who lived in this disaster area, I am going to assume you need the additional supplement. So I'm just going to give it to you straight up. You are only using the disaster gross income limit for the new households that are applying for disaster CalFresh or for the excluded members. So basically, any ongoing CalFresh household that walks through the door who's not at the maximum is going to get a supplement.
Okay. Kirby?
So, I'm not sure if I understood when you start using the income. So in the whole benefit period, July 23rd through August 22nd, is somebody paid like once a month the first of the month, and they're not getting common benefits currently? But they then we looked at having any income in the 2000 period because they didn't get that income after July 23rd.
Okay, the question is for those people who are paid once a month and they're paid on the 1st. And the benefit period doesn't start until July 23rd. How do we count that income?
So what you ask the household is, on July 23rd, how much money did you have left? That is considered the available liquid resources. So then you ask, okay, in addition to that amount, did you get any new income from July 23rd forward? And you add those two together.
So they would count then the income they received if they received it on August 1st.
No, they would, right, yes. So the July income payment, the pay stub from July, you're going to only ask them what was left of that. For the
Correct.
August pay, you're going to consider that income.
Okay. Faith.
So I was just wondering about the supplemental CalFresh. I was under the impression that we were going to issue supplemental CalFresh in mass, like to anybody affected by the fire. Is that correct? They actually have to come in and apply for the settlement?
So the question is the supplemental benefits going to be issued in mass, or do they have to come in and apply for the benefits?
We're going to do
For the
both.
ongoing- It's going to be both.
So what we're going to do, and Melanie, you can help me out here, but we're going to issue the automatic supplements based on zip code very early, I think the first day of the application period. So if you go into the system and you see that the household already got an automatic supplement, you cannot double them up. But there are some zip codes in Shasta County that aren't going to get automatic supplements. They would have to come in individually.
So we do know the zip codes.
Yeah.
So those zip
I would-
codes. Go ahead.
I would
Alexa.
keep a list of the zip codes handy in your pocket.
So those zip codes will be given to the people who are working disaster CalFresh, probably also the evacuation maps. I am not in charge of that, so whoever is in charge of staffing and scheduling will be providing that to the workers. Hold on. Rose?
Back to the IPD and the workstation, say that they actually tell us during that interview that they have income. Are we going to use their full net income, or is it prorated? Say that we weren't using it in the CalFresh case, like for their kids yet.
So the question is, the client comes in, the excluded member, IPV, comes in and during the interview they say they have income that has not been used in the case. Do we use the full amount of income, or what do we do?
Yes, if no proration has been applied to that income some other time, then you use the full income, because again, you're using best available info. So we're not asking you to go through the whole CalFresh eligibility process to determine what should have been prorated.
Okay, so we would use the best available
Yeah.
income, that information we have.
Yeah.
Okay, Tabitha?
So the replacement benefits that were just issued on Monday night, you're saying there's going to be an additional mass replacement to go up to the maximum allotment for all those households?
So the question is, the mass replacements that went out earlier, the supplemental benefits are different and will be going out on August 21st, the night of.
Correct. So if a household of one had a monthly benefit of $150, we replaced 30% of their benefits, so they would have gotten a mass replacement of about $45. But then here comes the automatic supplement, and they're eligible for the difference between $150 and $192, so they would receive another $42.
Faith? Okay.
Looking back and what is looking, replacements look back, supplements look forward.
Okay. Did you hear that?
Batch gonna be putting in a journal entry when they run those and issue those, so that.
Probably not. The question was, is Batch going to put in a journal entry? And probably not. That's
Yeah,
a
I wouldn't be
C4.
able to answer that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a C4 question. Yes, Katie.
I have a question about the liquid resources. So you've stated that we need to look at them as of July 23rd. But so say somebody had cash in their home and they weren't evacuated until, say, August 5th. And then they lose all the cash they had in their home, and at that point their mortgage and carpet, everything's come out. And at that point their liquid and income is under the limit. However, on the 23rd, it was not. Does that mean they are not eligible?
No,
Hear
that
that,
is, I heard it. Yeah, that is special because now you have not only the liquid resources question, but you have the inaccessible liquid resources. And remember that slide with the giant red circle that said, oh, it's going to be rare, but if you do have liquid resources that become inaccessible, don't include them.
So, but if they fall under that limit after the 23rd, are we going to consider them eligible at that point? Is it like at any point their amount is under the limit, then they're eligible, or do they have to be eligible on the 23rd? And what happens after that doesn't matter?
Oh, no. Yeah. So my emphasis on the 23rd was only as a trying to help explain how to address the fact that the income and the resources are looked at the same time. But the point in time for July 23rd question was only with how much cash did you have available. That would be your resources. Then anything in terms of cash or even a check that comes in after that, you just put that in the income bucket. So July 23rd was only me trying to be helpful on defining cash on hand.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Thank you.
Now I'm like, maybe that's confusing. Okay, so I'm going to keep going to verifications if you guys are ready.
Yep.
Okay, so verification rules are significantly eased during a disaster to reduce the administrative burden and to reflect sometimes the reality that households may not have access to the same verification resources or sources that they usually would. So the verification requirements are 3-tiered. We're going to go through these. On the next slide, we have a chart, but just quickly, you must verify identity. You must verify residency and loss of income or resources when possible, and household composition and food loss only if questionable. So let's go to a chart because I think this kind of just lays it out a little bit more cleanly. So for identity, verification is mandatory for the applicant. That can be a photo ID, 2 other documents that verify identity and residency, a signed affidavit from a collateral contact. So some of the same techniques we use for regular CalFresh, but again, it's only for the applicant. When possible and practicable, oh my gosh, tongue slide. Okay, so residency, you should verify it when you can. You can use things like utility bills, tax bills, driver's license, other IDs with address, or in this case, like someone who has a Shasta County library card and a Shasta County, some other identification probably lives in Shasta County, and that's sufficient. For household composition, it's only required it's questionable. That's why we suggest, like, you can orally ask the person to name the household members, give you their birth dates, give you some information like their age, and if the person is able to easily answer those questions, you should be fine. It's only when the answers don't quite match up, right? So you suspect that maybe this isn't the household comp that truly exists. For liquid resources or income, again, this is when possible. You can ask for the usual check stubs, bank statements, receipts for expenses, what you usually would refer to. Just keep in mind that sometimes, depending on the household circumstances, it may not be as easily available as it would have been in the past. So what we have seen in other counties is basically if things sound reasonable, like, I knew that area was evacuated, so it's not unreasonable that the person would say they spent time in a hotel and therefore had to incur a cost. So use some judgment there. And then for food loss, again, only if questionable. And this is why you want to keep some of those power outage maps and zip codes handy, because if you were in a zip code that experienced a power outage. Maybe it didn't meet the threshold for an automatic replacement, but it's likely that you yourself would have experienced a power outage that led to food loss. So just keeping some of that info handy will be helpful. I alluded to this a little while ago, but just quickly a couple of notes on benefit issuance. Sure that disaster CalFresh benefits are made available as soon as possible and hopefully no later than 72 hours from application, except for questionable cases. And we really haven't talked about questionable cases in too much detail, but I will just say a questionable application could include application for which the interview was not completed, so maybe you scheduled an appointment and they did not return. You've requested verifications for whatever reason and they have not been provided, so that extension could apply to 7 days. Or information provided by the household does not match up with what is known to the county about a disaster. For example, someone says that they incurred major damage, they lost their home, but you know that that neighborhood was not in the path of the fire, and so that information might be questionable. How exactly was your home impacted? As well, households who were previously denied during the application period but reapply should be considered questionable to some extent. And basically that's because it's possible that a household's circumstances have changed, but it's a pretty limited time period, so it's not completely the most likely to happen. So you just want to make sure you're assessing carefully whether their circumstances did change. If they applied, you know, like 2 days ago and they were denied then, what really changed in those 2 days? You want to be careful about that because we have had return clients who, once they're familiar with the eased process, may share different information. And then we'll be issuing disaster CalFresh benefits on regular EBT cards because you guys are operating out of your offices. So no special training on disaster CalFresh cards. And just in closing here, the Federal Food and Nutrition Service recently on ensuring disaster CalFresh access. So for elderly and persons with disabilities, other vulnerable populations as well. So I've added it here just as a kind of friendly reminder. As with regular CalFresh, the ACA and other laws require the county to provide equal access with or to people with disabilities, including reasonable accommodations. In addition to the ADA, special provisions for elderly and people with disabilities to ensure that they are safe and comfortable. So you guys are operating out of the office. That is makes ensuring these provisions are in place much easier, but you know, it's keeping an eye on like an elderly person who's standing in a line that might be longer than usual, that you might offer that person a seat or make sure that they're comfortable since the wait and the line might be a little longer than usual. As well, and we've already made some efforts in this area, we want to provide limited English proficient individuals with access to the through bilingual staff, interpreters, and translated documents. The county has done a good job of translating a lot of outreach materials, so know that we will do our best to meet that need as well. And just trying to keep that application experience as possible. Recognize that crowds and long challenge, but just keeping it in mind is an important step to make it good. With that, now a portion of our question and answer. So if there are any questions, to take them.
Okay, so you've been kind of breaking up, but we do have a couple of questions. So Veronica?
So when we put on our request for verification lists and deadlines, I mean, because normally you would have opportunities to send them a request for verification. What if they came in, they didn't even have an ID? And they need to go down to the DMV and get one. But we're not going to just sit that application down and say, hey, come back when you have time. What kind of deadlines are we putting on our request for verifications?
So Am I breaking up or can you hear me now? Because this is an important
We
one.
can hear you now.
Okay. So this is the reason that the verification requirements are eased. So basically, you want to have the best verification available, but if it's not, you want to use some of the flexibilities that you have. So for example, on identity, using alternative verifications, a collateral contact, you can even phone a friend, and only if it's truly questionable would I say to someone, you need to come back. So these expenses just don't sound reasonable to me. I really do need you to go get those receipts and come back. What we're trying to do is avoid having people come back because they may not and you may not meet your issuance timeline.
So then I have a question.
Yes.
When it says up to 7 days, does that mean we have 7 days to get the verifications, or do we just have up to 7 days to get the
So in Ventura and Santa Barbara, they used the 7 days as the cutoff for the verification, and that worked pretty well.
Okay. So we could, so if we, as a county, decide we want to use 7 days as the cutoff for verifications, that we can do that, and
yes,
that would be fine. Okay.
Yes, because you're basically telling the household, if you don't return with these verifications, I'm not going to be able to process your application. I have a 7-day timeline I have to meet.
Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
So do we use the 2200 that offers county assistance, or do we use the DVR 100, or how do we request it?
The question is, do we use the CW 2200 or the VER 100 to request?
So the challenge is that there is no formal way to request a disaster CalFresh verification. If you guys have those handy, it's not going to cause any harm to give it to the person and fill it out for them. But it is not a required document, nor would we be reviewing to see if that notice is in the case file. And
so what is your suggestion is?
Well, I will say it has not been used in the past, and Aubrey is reminding me correctly so that we have a very low denial rate in general because we are a little bit more flexible than we are in regular CalFresh. And so what other counties have done is just really tried to maximize the number of people who don't have to come back.
Okay.
And we can talk offline, Melanie, about how to manage the narrow set of cases that really do need to come back.
Okay, sounds good, Alexis. Francine?
Are we going to have to go over any kind of rights or responsibilities during the interview?
Yes, it's on the CF 385.
Yeah.
Okay. What's on the 385?
Yes. Was there another question? Yes, Karen?
So, when we're conducting an interview, are we doing rights and responsibilities? I mean, this is not really helping me run an interview.
So the question is about the rights and responsibilities, and are we going over just what's on the CF 385?
That's correct. And remember, what you address in the interview in terms of a client's responsibilities is much less because you're basically just giving them a month of benefits and saying, that's it, you're done. That's the whole program. There's no reporting requirements. There's no coming back to report changes or change your benefit. There's none of that. So it's a lot more clear cut, and basically you're emphasizing that you need to share with me the most truthful information that you can.
And somebody had a question over here.
What about the issue of household cost for people omitting people from the household, like a 19-year-old that lives with his parents? I mean, are we just building them a new case even if they're potentially
So is that omitting somebody?
omitting like earners?
So the question is, what if we have someone that is omitting household members with income off the CF 385? Or
I
how
mean,
would we
if
even?
you have a sense that that is happening, so the interview just isn't matching up. One time they said somebody was there, then 2 minutes later they say someone else is not there, and it's not matching up. That would go into the category of questionable. You can either request additional verification. You can check your own system to see if this household maybe exists in some other meds record. You could even do a fraud referral. I don't know if I would do that because the time is so limited in terms of getting a result. But if the information is questionable to you, you have the ability to say, I'm going to need some more information.
Okay. Jennifer?
Well, what are our noticing requirements? Are we going to be required to do manual notices and things like that?
What are our noticing requirements?
So you issue a approval. That's it. And there's a disaster CalFresh approval notice.
Is that the?
I can't remember the number.
I think it's the 3 DFA 390. Yeah.
Yes, the DFA 390. It's vintage.
It is.
On the rare cases that there's a denial, the supervisor is supposed to immediately review the case? Are they supposed to, is there a proper procedure of documenting supervisory review?
Did you hear the question?
I think that was about having to provide for. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think I heard that the question was about denied cases and having to provide for supervisory review. So you are required to make that available to households that have been denied. And the goal here is to reduce the number of disaster CalFresh cases that go to hearing, because there are a limited number of circumstances that could go to hearing. So basically, you're just trying to prevent that with supervisory review if that's what the household would like.
So basically, if I'm hearing this correctly, if the client requests a supervisor review, then that's when the application would be reviewed?
Yes, so you want to make sure that when you're staffing your operation, you have sufficient supervisors so that denied cases can go to their review. So it's really a staffing issue.
That answer your question? Okay. Did we have, yes?
So two questions. One about that, if we deny it, do we have to tell them you can request a review on this? Or do we just say we denied it and it's whether they choose to question it or not?
So the question is, if we deny the application, do we just give them the denial notice, or do we let them know that their application can be reviewed by a supervisor?
So there is no explicit requirement, and what I've advised to others is if you issue a denial and the person is disgruntled, you can let them know that they can get a supervisory review if they would like.
Okay.
And then about the verification requirements, for things like the residency and the liquid resources, if they don't have them available, are we just saying that's okay as long as we don't find it questionable? Just to clarify.
So for liquid resources and residency, if they are not accessible, are we going to take the client's statement and go from there?
Yes, definitely.
Yes. Kirby?
Say the grandma and three SSI kids, are we building a home case in C1 for the three SSI kids? So every single excluded member from the household will be building a brand new case?
Yes.
To be added as a companion case to the.
Yes.
Okay. And if they have no case whatsoever, it's a brand new case.
Yes. Sorry, it was a C4 related case. Question. Okay, one question. Okay, so could we stop the talking so I can hear the questions. Could you repeat that, please?
For the income and assets for the verifications required, it says if questionable. Are we saying that they don't need to come with pay stubs to show us proof of income?
So the question is if income and verification, income and liquid resources, income and assets are questionable. It's on the, so if income and assets are questionable, do we need to have them come, do they need to come in with a verification, or can we?
It says for the verifications required, it says income/assets.
Okay, it's on the.
If questionable, so are we saying they don't need the pay stubs unless we don't think there's something?
So do we need the pay stubs, or unless that we think that it's questionable? It's on the verification rule.
So on the chart for income and resources, you want to verify it when possible. That will get you a complete case record. And you can be creative. You can have them pull up a bank statement. You can have them show you, an old pay stub. Maybe it's not the most up to date, but shows a relatively similar amount of money. So technically, it's not required, but you want to get it when you can.
So did that answer your question? Amy?
I haven't read the responsibility, but are the problems all the same as far as if you find out later that something was not truthful, that it should be reviewed for an overpayment?
So the question is, if we find out after we've granted the DCF that the client was not truthful, do we charge an overpayment?
Yes, disaster CalFresh overpayments do exist. So yes, let's say that somehow you found income verification and it was significantly different. So we're not talking about like I was off by $5. We're talking about you told me you had $500 in income and actually you had $3,000 in income. Then yes, you could proceed with a disaster CalFresh overpayment.
Okay, but if it's like $20
if they're using their memory. Yeah,
right,
so
like
we just talked about the fact that they may not have the same standard of verification available, so you ask them, what is, off the top of your head, what's your income? And they say, well, last month it was about $1,100, and it turns out it was actually $1,125. That would just be, not an intentional lie, but rather, I gave you my best estimate.
Right. Okay. Is that good, Amy? Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Tabitha?
So back to her question, on this chart, it says it's the loss or inaccessibility of liquid resources and income, that whenever possible, we should verify that. So if it's not that they lost their job or anything like that, they're based off their net income from their checks, in addition to their expenses and everything, it puts them under. Are you wanting us to verify their normal pay stubs?
So the question
is, it says only when it's questionable on this sheet.
So on on this same verification requirements, it says only if questionable that we have to verify income and liquid resources. So again, do we have to verify income or only if it's questionable?
I'm sorry, I'm on slide, let me tell you which slide, with the verification chart?
Yes.
That I have pulled up right now, it says when possible.
Yes. Oh,
so,
if possible. So if possible.
Yeah.
She's looking at the second page, it says if questionable verify.
Okay, she's looking at the verification tool, which is not on the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, yes. That was from my friends in Ventura County as well. Did you catch an error? We can fix it.
Let me.
Is it the one pager?
Yeah, it's the one pager.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, income and assets, if questionable, pay stubs, bank statements, etc. And I can see why it's confusing.
So I have the federal version of the chart in front of me, and it does say when possible. So we can fix the paper version, but I've got the Fed disaster guide.
So this is from Ventura County. This was their tool.
And we have a Word version, so we can make improvements over time.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, Tabitha.
So the chart is saying it's a loss of income. So we're wanting to verify that. They're not, say someone's not saying they had a loss of income. It's just they had so many disaster-related expenses it puts them under the net. Or you wanting us to verify their regular checks. They're not saying they had a loss of income or inaccessible income. They got paid their normal amount that they get paid. But because they had so much going on and they had to pay for so many different things, are we still wanting to verify their normal pay stubs?
So did you hear that? Okay, so
Yeah.
Are we still requiring them to verify their normal income, even if they say they have spent all of their income on disaster-related expenses? Is that correct, Tabitha?
Well, so if we go back to the bubbles, if you first do the cash on hand and you add that to the income, what you're asking yourself is the disaster-related expenses, you're taking that out of that combination. So if the person's disaster-related expenses are greater than even the cash available and the income during that period, then yes, they would definitely be eligible.
So would they need to provide proof of their income in order to verify, or would that be if possible?
It's always if possible. And this is, so I just want to be, this is one of the toughest parts, because we have like drilled into our brains, the one thing you always verify is income. But in this case, because you generally have eased the verification burden, you're going to collect that verification if it's possible to do so. The person brought it with them. You could even see like a direct deposit in their online bank account, you know, all of these kind of their own statement, if that's what the best that's available. But it is a lot more flexible than we are used to. So I know it kind of makes us uncomfortable because that's what we do. We verify income, but it's only when possible.
Does that answer? Yes, Carrie?
You had mentioned a supervisory review because of limited hearing rights. What's the difference in hearing rights with disaster CalFresh and regular CalFresh?
So what's the difference between hearing rights for disaster CalFresh and regular CalFresh?
So they can only go to hearing for a couple of narrow reasons. And here it is. Any household who applied for disaster CalFresh and was denied benefits may request a fair hearing. A household that disputes the household size used in calculating its benefit amount may also request a hearing. So that's the limited circumstances. Households who do not apply cannot request a hearing, even if they were unaware. So like someone cannot go to hearing because they did not hear about the application period. They have no right to that benefit. But if they were denied or they think that the household size calculation was wrong, then they can go to hearing.
What's the timeline on that?
What's the timeline on the request for hearing? Is it the same?
It's the same. So otherwise, the fair hearing, even the reporting is on the existing federal report. So the only kind of unique thing, I don't know if this is the right group, but just as an aside, you cannot use a disaster CalFresh benefit to pay off an existing overissuance. So if any household comes in and then says to you, thank you so much, can I now use this to pay off my OI or reduce my benefit reduction? No, you cannot. So it's intended for food, not for paying off overissuances.
Okay, so we're at the end of our training time. Does anybody have any more questions? Yes, Katie.
What about people who live in other counties, residents of other counties, that they worked here and say their employer was evacuated for a week, so they lost their week? Are we putting them in T4 and running them with a regular address or with the work address, or how's that working? If they're otherwise eligible, as far as income and liquid resources, how does that work?
Did you hear that, Alexis?
Yes, I think it was, if you are claiming eligibility based on having worked in the county, what do you put into the C4 system? The C4 system should allow you to indicate that they worked, not lived in the county. So you can put the work address or their residency address, but let's just remind ourselves again, it's just for 1 month of benefits. So you probably won't go back to that case to like mail them a notice or anything. So accuracy of addresses is a little less of an issue here.
Okay. All right, so if there's no other questions, thank you for coming.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and